Okay, so today we are going to be exploring some basic watercolor techniques. So we're going to start with one of my favorite techniques, which is wet on wet. So what that means is I'm going to wet down my brush. I'm going to get the paper wet. So wet on wet means I have a wet wash and then a wet paper. So let me go ahead and grab some color. Okay, so the paper's already wet and I'm going in with the paint and it's going to spread like that and create a really nice effect. This is so much fun to play with because you don't ever know what's going to happen with the paper or with the paint, where it's going to go. Wet on dry, you have a little more control over this. So what you're doing is you are painting onto the dry paper. So wet paint onto dry paper. So you can see when I paint, I have a lot more control about where it's going. So this is good, for example, if I want to paint a leaf-like shape or something like that, I have a lot more control about where the paint goes. Okay, now dry brush, what this is, so I'm going to grab a little paper towel here. I should have had that ready. Reach. Okay, so dry brush is when I'm going in with a dry brush and mainly dry paint onto dry paper. So I'm basically just getting paint here, and I'm going to do this. Now, this is a nice technique if you're looking to get some texture. Most of the time, you don't want this to happen. Most of the time, if this is how your watercolor looks, you're doing something wrong. You're not using enough water. But if you're doing a specific dry brush technique, this is a really cool effect to do. A resist. Now, water and wax don't like each other. So if I draw some lines here, when I paint over those lines, can you see how it's going around it? It's going to avoid wherever the wax was, and when that dries, it's going to go over the wax. That's kind of cool. Splatter is one of my other favorite things to do with watercolor paint. So I'm going to grab some color here. And what I like to do is I like to hold out my finger like so, and I just kind of will tap. It's going to, of course, splatter the rest of my paper, but that gives you an idea. Now, if I would have put down wet paint, let's try that. So if I go ahead and, let's say that paper was wet, and then I splattered, look at the completely different effect. Look at how cool that is, how it runs together, and it's going to create these little bubbles. So that is a lot of fun to play with. Okay, now lifts. One of the fun things about watercolor paint is you can lift it back up off the paper. So if I paint some down, okay, it's pretty wet. There's a couple ways I can lift that back up. Number one, I could grab a paper towel or a Kleenex or something. That's going to take it back up off the paper. So this is a really helpful tip for creating clouds, okay? Another way I can lift up paint is to go over it with my brush. So if I paint some blue, okay, if I wring out my brush, so I kind of swish it around in a figure 8 motion, dry it off, I come and pick some up, it's pretty dry. This is a fun way to create like sun rays. So if I draw lines, you can see I'm just dabbing that brush off. So I'm going to grab some paint, create a line, dab it off, create a line, dab it off, and I'm going to lift up that paint. So that is a super fun effect and can be super helpful if you want to create like sun rays or something like that. The last technique I'm going to show you is blending. So let's say I want to blend, let's choose blue and yellow, and we'll make a green in the middle. I'm going to start with a wet brush, wet paint, and I'm going to just start painting here. Paint some of that. Okay. Now, if I want to create a gradient, I'm just going to add more water. So the more water, the lighter it's going to be. So can you see I added more water, and look, then it faded to almost nothing. So dark to light. Now, if I want to create a blend of two colors, I'm going to grab some blue. I'm going to paint. Okay. Now I'm going to start to work that out. And then this time I'm going to grab some yellow. Come in. I'm going to layer that right over top of each other. Okay, switch my brush around. And of course, blue and yellow are going to make green. So now I've got this really cool gradient. It's called a gradient when I'm going from blue all the way to yellow. So I just kind of ran them together. So that is always fun, all the way to yellow with all the shades of green and turquoise and blue in the middle. Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. Okay, there's some really fun watercolor techniques. Another really important thing to know when you're painting with watercolor is that it's going to dry 20% to 30% lighter than it went on. So however this looks right now, it's going to be lighter when it dries. So keep that in mind as you're creating anything with watercolor. You want to err on the side of a little bit darker so that when it dries, it looks nice and bright and vibrant the way you want it. Okay, I hope you learned something today. I hope you guys have fun out there experimenting with your watercolor paints. Bye.